Good evening, brave souls. I'm Grim, and tonight I'll be your companion through the shadows. Together, we'll dive into stories that grow darker with every whisper. So, get comfortable if you're ready. The night is only just beginning. Erica hadn't planned on going out for Halloween. She had almost settled in with a cozy blanket and a scary movie when a small, elegant envelope slipped through her door. She stared, puzzled. The envelope was thick, black, and sealed with a red wax stamp in the shape of a skull. Curious, she opened it and read the note inside. You are invited to the annual Phantom Party. Location, 314 Shadow Lane. Be sure to stay until midnight, or risk becoming one of us forever. Erica laughed. A Halloween joke, she thought, but her interest was piqued. The invitation was detailed, listing events like the Dead Man's Dance and the Ghostly Feast. She'd never heard of Shadow Lane, though she'd lived in town for years. Still, Halloween was meant to be strange and spooky. Throwing on a quick costume, a ghostly white dress and some makeup to look a little pale, she set out to find the address. The night was foggy, and the air felt colder as she walked. Shadow Lane turned out to be a narrow, winding street, and the house at 314 loomed ahead, old and covered in creeping ivy. The place was lit by lanterns that cast eerie shadows, flickering with an unnatural blue glow. Guests in elaborate costumes floated around the front yard. Some were dressed as skeletons, others as vampires and witches, yet something about them was different. Erica tried to ignore the creeping feeling that something was off and stepped into the crowd. A tall man dressed as an old-fashioned butler approached, his face pale and expressionless. "Miss Erica, we are delighted you could join us," he said, with a voice so smooth it was chilling. "How do you know my name?" Erica asked, uneasy. The butler didn't answer, simply bowed and gestured toward the open door. "The party awaits, and the clock ticks." Stepping inside, Erica was struck by the grandeur of the house. A grand staircase spiraled upward, draped in dark, dusty velvet. The walls were lined with portraits that seemed to watch her as she moved. Music drifted from somewhere, a haunting melody that made her feel like she'd stepped back in time. In the dining room, a feast was laid out: roasted meats, pastries, fruit, and goblets brimming with deep red punch. Everything was decorated with cobwebs and candelabras, flickering in the dim light. Around her, guests were laughing, whispering, and mingling, their laughter sometimes echoing strangely, as if it came from far away. A girl about her age, dressed as a flapper, drifted over. "First time at the Phantom Party?" she asked, a strange gleam in her eye. "Yeah, it's impressive," Erica replied, feeling an odd chill. The girl leaned in. "Just remember, don't leave before midnight. They don't like it when guests leave early." "Why?" Erica asked. But the girl just laughed, a hollow, chilling sound, and disappeared into the crowd. As the night went on, Erica noticed odd things about the guests. Their costumes looked a little too real. The knight's armor was scratched and rusty. The Victorian lady's dress had faded, yellowed lace, and the vampire's teeth gleamed in a way that made her uncomfortable. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed, and suddenly a hush fell over the crowd. A man in a dark cape stepped forward, raising a silver goblet. "To the midnight hour," he announced, his voice echoing off the walls. "For those who stay become part of the legend." The guests raised their glasses in a silent toast, all eyes turning toward Erica with expressions that made her skin crawl. Her heart raced. This party didn't feel like a joke anymore. Feeling uneasy, she glanced at the door. calculating if she could slip out unnoticed. She edged backward, slowly toward the entrance. Just as her hand brushed the doorknob, a voice whispered close to her ear, "Leaving so soon." She whipped around to find the butler's pale face inches from hers. His expression was blank, his eyes like shadows. "Miss Erica, the night isn't over yet," he said in a low, ominous tone. "The master doesn't like guests who break the rules." Panicking, she turned and bolted down the hallway, her footsteps echoing as the eerie music started up again, louder this time, like it was chasing her. She reached the door, tugged it open, and stumbled outside, gasping in the cold night air. But as she ran down the steps, she glanced back and saw the guests standing in the doorway, watching her with blank, hollow eyes. They didn't follow her, but their presence seemed to stretch, pulling her back like invisible chains. She turned and ran harder, her heart pounding. Shadow Lane stretched endlessly, twisting and turning, the fog thickening until she couldn't see her own feet. Her footsteps echoed, but she could swear she heard others behind her, getting closer. Desperate, she glanced over her shoulder and saw the flapper girl, her face now gaunt and ghostly, her eyes sunken. She reached out, whispering, "Come back, Erica. The party's not over." "No!" Erica screamed, sprinting faster. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to escape. She kept running, the fog thickening, swallowing her until everything was a blur. Finally, the fog lifted, and she found herself back at her front door. Heart racing, she stumbled inside, slamming the door behind her. She looked at the clock, 11:59 p.m. Just in time. Collapsing on the couch, she tried to catch her breath. It felt like she had just escaped a nightmare, the ghostly images still flashing in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes watching her, pulling her back to that haunted place. The next morning, Erica found the invitation on her doorstep again, the red wax seal unbroken, as if she'd never opened it. Her name was still written in elegant script, and beneath it, a chilling new message. "You broke the rule. See you next year. Midnight sharp." As she held the invitation, her hand started to tremble. From somewhere outside, she heard faint, ghostly laughter drifting on the breeze. She knew then that the phantom party was far from over, and that her next invitation would be waiting. The Johnson family moved to Gray Hollow in late October, their car loaded with pumpkins, costumes, and Halloween decorations. Sarah, their 8-year-old daughter, was especially excited. Halloween was her favorite time of year. But as they drove through the sleepy town, she noticed something strange. No pumpkins, no decorations, no costumes in store windows. In Gray Hollow, it was as if Halloween didn't exist. The family settled into their new home, and that night, Sarah asked, "Why don't people here celebrate Halloween?" Her parents exchanged glances. They hadn't thought much of it, assuming people just didn't decorate early. Mr. Johnson shrugged. "Maybe it's just a quiet town, sweetheart. But don't worry, we'll have our Halloween." The next day, Mrs. Johnson took Sarah to the local grocery store. When she asked a clerk where they could find Halloween candy, the young man paled. "You're new here, aren't you?" "Yes," Mrs. Johnson replied, surprised at his reaction. "We don't celebrate Halloween in Gray Hollow. No one's supposed to. Not since. Well, it's best if you don't either." He quickly walked away, leaving Sarah and her mother puzzled. On the way home, they passed the town library. A small sign posted on the door read, "October 31st, town-wide curfew. Stay indoors. No celebrations." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She tugged on her mom's sleeve, whispering, "Mom, why would they have a curfew for Halloween?" Mrs. Johnson squeezed her hand. "Don't worry, honey. People here are just different." That evening, determined to bring Halloween to Grey Hollow, they carved pumpkins on the porch. Neighbors passed by, giving them wary looks, some even crossing the street to avoid walking near them. One elderly woman stopped and, shaking her head, warned, "You're making a mistake, bringing Halloween here." "What's the big deal?" Sarah asked. "It's just pumpkins." The woman looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with a fear that made Sarah shiver. "The Hollow doesn't take kindly to being disturbed. Halloween draws them out." That night, Sarah's parents went to bed, but she couldn't sleep. Shadows danced on her bedroom wall, making her feel like she wasn't alone. Then she heard it, a soft scratching, like claws scraping against wood. She sat up, heart pounding, and tiptoed to the window. Outside, mist had settled over the lawn, creeping up the porch steps. The carved pumpkins glowed dimly, their faces twisted in the mist. And then she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of their yard, just beyond the streetlight. It looked like a child, dressed in ragged, old-fashioned clothes, its head turned slightly as if watching her. But the eyes, empty and dark, glinted with something cold and unnatural. The next morning, she told her parents what she'd seen, but they dismissed it as a nightmare. Determined, her father declared, "We'll go trick-or-treating tomorrow night. Maybe people just need someone to remind them of Halloween fun." As the sun set on Halloween, they dressed up, Sarah as a witch, her mom as a ghost, and her dad in a clown mask. But when they stepped outside, they found the town deathly silent, the houses dark, curtains drawn tightly closed. Even the streetlights seemed dimmer. "Let's just go to a few houses," Mr. Johnson insisted, but every door they knocked on remained closed. Sarah was about to suggest going home when she saw something down the street. A child in an old costume, almost like the one she'd seen in the mist, was standing by a house, motioning for her to come closer. "Look," Sarah whispered, pointing. But as her parents squinted into the gloom, the child seemed to disappear. "Sarah, there's no one there," her mom said, rubbing her arms against the sudden chill. Frustrated, Sarah marched toward the spot where she'd seen the child, ignoring her parents' calls to stop. As she reached the darkened house, she saw not one, but several children, all in strange, tattered costumes, their faces blank and pale. They stood in a circle, watching her in eerie silence. Suddenly, one of them whispered, "You brought Halloween back." "What? What do you mean?" Sarah stammered, her voice shaking. "Long ago, we celebrated too, until Halloween cursed us," a boy murmured, his voice hollow. "Now, every Halloween night, we wake, looking for someone to join us. You invited us back." Sarah stumbled backward, but the ghostly children closed in, their faces flickering between shadows and something dark, ancient. Her parents ran up, grabbing her by the arm. "We're going home," Mr. Johnson said, his voice tight with fear. As they hurried back, the children followed, their footsteps silent on the pavement, growing closer with every step. The mist thickened, wrapping around them, chilling Sarah to the bone. Finally, they reached their house, slamming the door shut and locking it behind them. But the moment they turned around, the pumpkin on the porch flared brightly, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed. The children were outside, watching through the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. They chanted in soft, chilling voices. "You brought Halloween back. Now you must stay." Suddenly, the front door rattled, as if an invisible hand was trying to push it open. Sarah's dad held it shut, yelling for her mom to get something to block the door. Then they heard it. A voice, clear and cold, whispered through the house. "You should have listened. Halloween isn't welcome here." The house seemed to breathe, creaking as shadows slid down the walls, wrapping around them. The windows rattled, the lights flickered, and that eerie chant filled every corner. Sarah clung to her mother, too frightened to cry. Finally, the clock struck midnight, and a deep silence fell over the room. The shadows retreated, the whispers faded, and the door stopped shaking. They waited, holding their breath, until the mist outside began to clear. When they finally opened the door, the ghostly children were gone, and the pumpkins on the porch were smashed to pieces. Only a faint echo of the chant lingered in the air, as if carried away by the wind. Grey Hollow returned to its quiet, Halloweenless life, but the Johnsons knew they wouldn't forget that night. Every October, they left a single candle burning on their porch, a quiet promise to the restless souls of the town that Halloween would remain undisturbed. And as they placed the candle down each year, Sarah swore she could feel eyes watching, waiting, just beyond the edge of the light. It was Halloween night, and the Cairo Museum was buzzing with excitement. For the first time in years, a new exhibition was opening. The Secrets of the Pyramids. Tourists and locals gathered to glimpse artifacts that had been hidden for centuries. Among them were American teenagers, Jake, Maya, and Ryan, in Egypt on a study-abroad trip. The trio had heard the rumors about the pyramids, the ancient curses, the restless spirits, but they shrugged them off as silly legends. They were more interested in seeing history up close. Earlier that day, while exploring the Giza Plateau, something strange happened. As they walked around the base of the Great Pyramid, Ryan spotted a dog standing near the stone steps leading up the side. The dog was tall, its fur sleek and dark, and its eyes, glowing gold, seemed to watch them. "That's creepy," Maya muttered, stepping closer to Jake. Before they could do anything, the dog started climbing the pyramid, its powerful limbs carrying it effortlessly up the steep stone blocks. "Is that even allowed?" Jake asked, snapping a photo with his phone. But the dog moved higher, disappearing over the top. They didn't think much of it at the time. Stray animals were common in the area. But later that night, inside the museum, strange things started happening. As they wandered through the exhibition, admiring golden statues and ancient hieroglyphs, Maya suddenly froze. "Did you see that?" Jake and Ryan turned to look. One of the statues, a sleek, jackal-headed figure, seemed to be watching them. Its eyes, made of polished onyx, glittered in the dim light. "It's just a statue, Maya," Ryan said, rolling his eyes. But Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As they moved deeper into the exhibit, a cold wind blew through the room, making the torches on the walls flicker. "Where's that wind coming from?" Jake asked, frowning. They were deep inside the museum, far from any open windows or doors. Just then, the lights flickered and a low, guttural growl echoed through the hall. Maya spun around. "Did you hear that?" "I don't like this," she whispered. The three friends quickly left the exhibit, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over them. As they stepped outside, Ryan laughed nervously. "Okay, that was freaky. Let's just grab some food and forget about it." But forgetting wasn't going to be easy. As they made their way down the street, a shadow moved out of the corner of Maya's eye. She turned to see the same dog from earlier, standing at the entrance to a dark alleyway, its glowing eyes locked on her. "It's that dog again!" Maya exclaimed. Ryan shook his head. "It's just a stray. Probably followed us from the pyramids." But deep down, none of them believed that. Something about the dog felt wrong, too intelligent, too deliberate. As they hurried back to their hotel, the dog stayed behind, but the sense of unease followed them. That night, Maya woke with a start. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up in bed, glancing around the dark room. Her window was open, and the wind was howling outside. She swore she heard whispers, ancient, unintelligible voices carried on the wind. Suddenly, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from Jake. "Come outside. I saw the dog again." Maya quickly got dressed and rushed downstairs, meeting Jake and Ryan in the hotel lobby. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaky. Jake pointed out the window. "There it is." The dog was standing in the courtyard, staring up at them. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, faint figures flickered in the darkness, shadowy shapes that seemed to be watching them from the edges of the night. "We need to leave," Maya whispered. "Now." But before they could move, the door to the courtyard swung open on its own, and a blast of icy wind hit them. The dog stepped forward, its golden eyes glowing brighter than ever. And then, right before their eyes, the dog began to change. Its fur rippled, its limbs elongating, and within moments, it was no longer a dog, but a towering figure, its body wrapped in ancient bandages, a jackal's head atop its shoulders. It was Anubis, the ancient god of the dead. The shadowy figures behind him grew clearer, revealing themselves as the spirits of long-dead pharaohs and priests, their faces twisted with anger and sorrow. They had been awakened. What do we do?" Ryan stammered, backing away. Anubis raised a hand, and the spirits surged forward, their cold skeletal fingers reaching for the living. Jake, Maya, and Ryan ran, bursting out of the hotel and into the streets. But no matter how fast they ran, the spirits were always just behind them, their hollow whispers filling the air. "They're not going to stop!" Jake shouted, glancing over his shoulder. "We have to do something!" Maya's mind raced. "The museum!" she gasped. "The artifacts! They're connected to the spirits somehow." Without another word, they changed direction, sprinting back toward the Cairo Museum. When they reached the entrance, the doors were locked. Desperate, Ryan grabbed a rock and smashed a window. They climbed inside, hurrying back to the pyramid exhibit. The shadowy figures followed them into the museum, filling the halls with their icy presence. Anubis strode through the broken door, his jackal eyes gleaming in the darkness. Maya's heart pounded as she scanned the room, her eyes landing on a massive stone tablet covered in ancient hieroglyphs. "There!" she cried, pointing to the tablet. "That's the key!" Ryan grabbed it, nearly dropping it from the weight. As the spirits closed in, Maya frantically searched the tablet for something, anything, that could help. Her eyes landed on a line of text. "This is it," she shouted. "We have to read it aloud." Together, the three of them began chanting the ancient words, their voices trembling. The spirits recoiled, their forms flickering like flames in the wind. Anubis let out a deafening roar, his massive form shaking the walls of the museum. But they didn't stop. They kept chanting, louder and louder, until the spirits began to fade, their cold whispers growing fainter. Anubis snarled, stepping toward them, but with one final chant, his form exploded into a burst of dark smoke, vanishing into the night. The room fell silent. The spirits were gone. Breathing heavily, Maya, Jake, and Ryan collapsed onto the floor, staring at the now empty space where Anubis had stood. "Is it over?" Ryan whispered. Maya nodded, still catching her breath. "I think so. We broke the curse." Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The town of Cairo was waking up, unaware of the ancient terror that had been unleashed and defeated on Halloween night. But as they left the museum, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits weren't truly gone. Anubis had been an avatar, a symbol of something far older, far darker. And in the quiet corners of the world, ancient forces were always watching, waiting for the right moment to return. For now, they were safe. But Halloween in Cairo would never be the same. It was Halloween night, and the town of Ravens Hollow was buzzing with excitement. Every year, the streets filled with kids in costumes, pumpkins glowed on porches, and the air was thick with the scent of candy and mischief. But there was one house that no one ever visited. The old, crumbling mansion at the end of Cedar Lane, known simply as the Shadow House. For years, the house had been abandoned, its windows boarded up, and the yard overgrown with weeds. The townsfolk whispered about strange noises coming from inside and shadows moving in the windows when no one was there. No one dared to go near it, except for the bravest of kids, and only on a dare. This Halloween, 12-year-old Josh and his friends, Max and Emily, were feeling extra bold. Josh had just moved to Ravens Hollow a few months ago, and his friends were trying to outdo each other with stories of the town's spooky legends. But the Shadow House was the crown jewel of their tales. "We should go inside," Josh said, trying to sound fearless. Max and Emily exchanged uneasy glances. "You mean tonight?" Emily asked, her voice a little shaky. "Why not? It's just an old house. All those stories are fake anyway," Josh said, trying to convince himself more than anyone. Max looked around. "It's Halloween. If we're ever going to do it, tonight's the night." And just like that, the dare was set. Later that night, after trick-or-treating, they met at the edge of Cedar Lane. The house loomed in the distance, its silhouette black against the moonlit sky. The closer they got, the quieter the neighborhood became. It was as if the house swallowed all sound, leaving only the crunch of their feet on the gravel road. "Still think this is a good idea?" Emily whispered. Josh didn't answer. The house looked more intimidating up close. Its broken shutters dangled on rusty hinges, and the front door hung slightly ajar, as if waiting for them. Max stepped forward first, pushing the door open with a creak that echoed through the night. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and cobwebs hung like curtains from the ceiling. The only light came from the moon, shining through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. "This place is creepy," Max said, trying to keep his voice steady. Emily clung to Josh's arm. "Let's just look around and get out of here. We proved our point." But Josh wasn't ready to leave. Something about the house intrigued him. It felt like it was pulling him deeper, like it had been waiting for them. "Let's check out the upstairs," he said, moving toward the staircase. As they climbed, the wooden steps groaned under their weight. The hallway at the top was lined with old family portraits, their eyes staring down at the kids, as if watching their every move. "This is like something out of a horror movie," Emily whispered. They reached the end of the hall, where a door stood slightly ajar. Josh pushed it open and froze. The room was filled with old toys, dolls, teddy bears, wooden blocks, covered in dust, as if no one had touched them in years. But what made his heart race was the mirror on the wall. It was cracked, but in its reflection, he could see something that wasn't in the room. "Do you guys see that?" Josh asked, pointing to the mirror. Max and Emily squinted at it. In the reflection, a shadowy figure stood in the corner of the room. A tall, dark figure with hollow eyes, staring back at them. "Let's get out of here!" Emily screamed, grabbing Josh's arm. But the door slammed shut behind them with a force that shook the walls. Josh rushed to the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked!" he shouted, panic rising in his chest. The room grew colder. The toys on the shelves began to tremble, and a low whisper filled the air. "Leave, now," the voice hissed, but there was nowhere to go. The shadow in the mirror moved, stepping closer to them with each passing second. Max backed up against the wall, eyes wide with terror. "What is that thing?" "I don't know," Josh yelled, pulling harder at the door. But it was no use. The shadow reached the edge of the mirror, and then it stepped out. The temperature in the room plummeted as the shadowy figure materialized before them. Its face was featureless, just darkness where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. It reached out a long, bony hand, and the toys in the room began to shake violently, flying off the shelves as if possessed by some unseen force. Emily screamed as a teddy bear shot past her head, smashing into the wall. Max ducked as a toy truck whizzed by his ear. "We have to do something!" he yelled. Josh, heart pounding, remembered something his grandma had told him about spirits. "They don't like light," she'd said. "Shadows only exist in darkness." "Max, your phone!" Josh shouted. Max fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling as he turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, and for a moment, the shadow figure recoiled, shrinking away from the light. "It's working!" Emily yelled, grabbing her phone and turning on its flashlight as well. The shadow let out an ear-piercing scream, its form flickering and shrinking as the light bathed the room. Josh kicked the door one last time, and it burst open. "Go, go, go!" he shouted, pushing his friends out into the hallway. They raced down the stairs, not daring to look back. The house seemed to groan in protest, as if trying to trap them inside. But they didn't stop. They bolted out the front door, into the cool night air, and didn't stop running until they were back on Cedar Lane, far away from the shadow house. Breathless, they collapsed on the sidewalk, hearts pounding, bodies trembling. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "What? What was that thing?" Josh shook his head, still trying to catch his breath. "I don't know, but I don't think it wanted us there." Max looked back at the house. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" Josh shrugged. "Doesn't matter. We're never going back there again." And from that night on, the shadow house remained as it always had, silent, dark, and avoided by everyone. But those who dared to look closely could sometimes see a shadow moving behind the cracked windows, waiting for the next group of kids brave or foolish enough to enter. It was the last week of October, and the Williams family decided to visit the small, hidden pumpkin patch on the edge of town. The place was called simply Whispering Acres. Mr. and Mrs. Williams, along with their 2 children, Lily and Max, had always loved the crisp, eerie magic of Halloween. But this year was different. They had heard rumors about whispering acres from friends who swore that every pumpkin there held a whisper of a story. But the real truth? No one really knew. As they pulled up to the edge of the old, misty field, the family was met with an unusual quiet. The pumpkins, scattered throughout the field in no particular order, seemed to sit in absolute stillness, each one perfectly round and untouched. The patch's entrance sign swung in the wind with an unsettling creak. Whispering acres. Pick with care. "I don't know," Mr. Williams murmured, shivering as he read the sign. "This place feels strange." "Oh, come on. It's just pumpkins, Dad," Max laughed, racing toward the field. Lily followed, clutching her favorite scarf. They wandered among the pumpkins, Max and Lily bouncing from one to the other, laughing, tugging their parents along. But then Lily stopped. She crouched by a pumpkin just a bit larger than her head, a flicker of something strange in her eyes. "Dad," she called out, her voice soft. "This pumpkin, it's whispering." Mr. Williams chuckled, though the air suddenly felt colder. "Pumpkins don't whisper, honey. They're just pumpkins." But Lily wouldn't move. She tilted her head, her face turning pale as she leaned closer. "No, Dad. It's talking. Listen." Mrs. Williams, sensing the tension, joined her daughter. She leaned in, and for a moment, she froze. Then she pulled back, her face blank with confusion. "Tom," she whispered, "I heard something too." Lily, trembling, reached out a hand and touched the pumpkin's surface. The moment her fingers made contact, a quiet voice filled her mind, drifting like a mist. Lost. Alone. Forgotten. Lily gasped and jerked her hand back. "Did you hear it?" she whispered, looking to her parents. Max, ever the skeptic, grinned and crouched next to another pumpkin, determined to hear something too. He pressed his ear to it. The air around him grew cold, and he could swear he heard someone's faint breath, like they were struggling to speak. "Help me! Don't forget!" Max leaped back, his grin wiped away. "Dad, that pumpkin, it's haunted," he stammered. They moved further into the patch, and everywhere they went, it was the same. Each pumpkin they touched whispered fragments of lost stories, voices full of regret, sadness, and sometimes anger. As they roamed the field, the whispers grew louder, overlapping, filling the quiet field with a symphony of sorrow. The family couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by invisible eyes, their presence disturbing the slumber of countless souls. Suddenly, Lily shrieked. She pointed to a small, particularly faded pumpkin. The voice inside this one was different. It was desperate, crying out as though trapped. "She's here, with the others, lost to the patch, trapped." "Mom," Lily whispered. "Who's she? Who's trapped?" Mrs. Williams felt an icy chill settle over her. "Let's leave, Tom, now," she urged. But just as she turned to lead her family back, Max called out, "Wait! There's one more!" He had wandered deeper into the field, standing before a massive pumpkin covered in cracks. As he stared at it, he felt an overwhelming urge to touch it, as if it was calling to him. When his fingers brushed its surface, the whispering around them faded, all voices falling silent. And then, in the dead quiet, a low, gravelly voice rumbled from the cracked pumpkin. "You disturbed us. You brought life into this patch. Now you must hear our stories." The voice resonated through each member of the Williams family, pressing against their minds like an ancient force. And with it came images of people, faces they didn't know, flashing before them in fragments. There was the face of a young woman with sorrowful eyes, an old man clinging to a pocket watch, a little girl clutching a doll. And then a terrible truth hit them. The people they were seeing were those who had vanished from the town over the years. All people who had gone missing around Halloween, never to be seen again. "It's them," Mrs. Williams murmured, horrified. "These are their spirits, trapped." The silence was broken by a sudden, mournful howl echoing through the patch. Shadows shifted, pooling beneath each pumpkin. The air grew thick, charged with an unseen energy, and a gust of wind swept through the field, scattering dead leaves and chilling them to the bone. "Mom," Lily whimpered, grabbing her mother's hand. "They're coming for us." As the wind grew stronger, the pumpkins started to glow faintly, one by one, as if a candle had been lit within each hollow shell. Their faces, hidden just moments before, were now twisted with expressions of anguish, anger, and despair. The Williams family stumbled back, horror dawning on them. They were surrounded by pumpkins, each one now staring at them with hollow, accusing eyes. The air hummed with their sorrow, with a grief that pressed down like a weight on their chests. "Stay with us," the voices whispered together. "Help us escape." Mr. Williams grabbed his children, desperate to protect them. "Run!" he shouted, pulling them toward the car. But the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift and buckle, as though the patch itself were trying to pull them back. They stumbled forward, pushing against the invisible pull of the field, until finally they reached the edge. They turned back one last time, watching the pumpkins dim, the whispers fading back into silence. The faces of the spirits vanished, leaving only the faint memory of their sorrow. In the car, the Williams family drove in silence, too shaken to speak. But the images of those faces haunted them, their eyes full of longing and hopelessness. And as they left whispering acres behind, they could still hear, faint and distant, the sound of voices carried by the wind. That night, as they sat around the dinner table, Max broke the silence. Do you think they're still there, stuck in that field?" His mother's face was pale. "I don't know, Max," she whispered. "But one thing is certain. That patch, it's not just pumpkins. It's something else. A place where the forgotten dead wait for someone to remember." They didn't speak of it again, but every Halloween after that, they'd hear whispers on the wind, as if the voices of whispering acres had followed them, asking to be freed, to be remembered. The Williams family would never return to the patch, but every Halloween, the sound of those whispers haunted them, a reminder that some spirits are never truly at rest. On Halloween, young Ben was rummaging through his grandma's attic. He was hunting for a costume after forgetting to buy one for trick-or-treating. Dust filled the air, clinging to old boxes and forgotten furniture. At the back of the attic, hidden beneath a pile of blankets, he found an old trunk, its hinges rusted and squeaky. Inside, Ben discovered a peculiar costume. It was a faded, patched-up jester's suit, black and red, with tiny silver bells sewn along the edges. He felt a thrill as he ran his fingers over the fabric, which was cold to the touch, despite the warm, stuffy attic. The suit seemed to call to him. Excited, he slipped into the costume. It fit perfectly, like it was made just for him, even though it looked like it had been there for decades. The moment he fastened the last button, he felt a shiver crawl up his spine. The attic lights flickered, casting strange shadows. For a split second, he thought he saw his reflection grinning in the cracked mirror in the corner of the room, even though he wasn't smiling. The sight unnerved him, but he shook it off. After all, it was Halloween. "Mom, look!" Ben called as he clattered down the stairs, the little bells jingling with each step. His mom glanced over and froze. Her face turned pale, and her smile faded. "Where did you find that, Ben?" "Just in the attic," he replied, spinning around to show off. "Pretty cool, huh?" But his mom looked unsettled, her eyes distant. She shook her head and forced a smile. "Well, don't be out too late. Be back by 9, okay?" Ben nodded, eager to meet up with his friends. He didn't notice the way his mom watched him from the doorway, her worry lingering long after he'd disappeared down the street. As he walked toward his friend's house, a strange sensation crept over him. The air felt colder, and every step made the bells jingle softly in the silent night. His neighborhood, usually lively on Halloween, seemed oddly still. Houses that usually had decorations now had darkened windows, almost as if they were abandoned. "Ben?" a voice called. He turned to see his friend, Jason, standing a few feet away, a look of confusion on his face. "Whoa, that costume, you look kinda creepy." Ben laughed, trying to shrug it off. "Just trying to be spooky, man." But even as he joked, he felt a strange itch crawling under his skin, like something in the suit was waking up. He looked at his hands and saw that his fingertips were pale and slightly gray, almost lifeless. He tried to rub them, but the color wouldn't come off. "Let's go," Ben said quickly, eager to shake off the eerie feeling. As the night went on, they moved from house to house, collecting candy. But something strange began happening. Each time Ben rang a doorbell, he noticed people would gasp, take a step back, and quickly toss candy into his bag without making eye contact. A few whispered, "That's a strange choice of costume," before shutting the door in a hurry. Jason seemed to be getting nervous too. "Ben, you're acting weird, and you look different." "What do you mean?" Ben asked, though he felt a heaviness spreading through his body. Jason stepped back, frowning. "Your eyes, they look dark." Ben glanced at a window, hoping to catch his reflection. His eyes were shadowed, as though rings of darkness were spreading around them. His smile, too, seemed stretched, pulling his mouth wider than it should go. It wasn't his reflection anymore. It was a stranger, someone, or something else. "Maybe we should go back," Jason said, edging away. But Ben shook his head, feeling a pull to keep going. "Come on, it's just a costume. We still have houses to hit." Jason hesitated, but followed, though he kept his distance. As they moved from house to house, the streets grew quieter. It felt as though they were stepping into a different world, one where shadows moved on their own, and distant whispers echoed with every step. Then they reached the last house on the block, a decrepit old place that everyone usually avoided. But tonight, Ben felt compelled to go up to it. Jason held back, watching with wide eyes as Ben climbed the creaky steps. Ben knocked on the door. The house felt alive, as though it was breathing, waiting. The door opened slowly, revealing a dim hallway filled with cobwebs. There was no one there, but a faint voice echoed, "Come in, little jester." Ben's legs moved on their own, carrying him inside. The door slammed shut, and he was swallowed by darkness. The sound of the bells on his costume grew louder, until they were almost deafening, drowning out his thoughts. In the dark, he saw shadows shifting, forming faces that sneered and whispered, "Another one joins us." Another lost soul. "Wait, what's happening?" Ben tried to shout, but his voice was muffled, trapped in his own head. He felt himself fading, his body merging with the jester suit, the cursed fabric wrapping around him tighter and tighter. Then he realized he wasn't the first. The costume had been worn by others before him, each Halloween claiming a new child who dared to wear it. Each child's soul was trapped, adding to the sinister essence that fueled the costume's curse. As he struggled, flashes of memories, not his own, flickered in his mind. Children from different times, each with the same look of horror, each realizing too late that they couldn't escape. Ben could feel their fear, their hopelessness, pressing in on him, trapping him. "Help!" he screamed. But the costume only laughed, a sound that echoed from deep within. Outside, Jason waited, staring at the darkened house. Minutes passed, and Ben didn't come out. Jason called his name, but there was no answer. He felt a chill, like a warning, and turned to run home. The next morning, Ben's mom knocked on his door, expecting to find him buried in candy wrappers. But his bed was empty. She checked the attic, hoping he'd come back to put the costume away. But the trunk was gone. For weeks, they searched the town, posting flyers and asking neighbors. But no one had seen him. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Only Jason knew about that last cursed house, but he was too afraid to go back and speak of what he'd seen. Years passed, and eventually, Ben's family moved away. But the old house remained, untouched, waiting. One Halloween night, a new family moved into the neighborhood. Their young son wandered into his attic, discovering a peculiar jester costume lying in an old, dusty trunk. He felt a strange pull as he touched it, a thrill of excitement that he couldn't quite explain. In the silence of the attic, he slipped it on, and somewhere deep within the fabric, a faint, trapped whisper echoed, joining the others, waiting for the next Halloween night. And as the darkness fades, remember, the real chills linger long after the story's end. Until next time, brave souls.